To make the rest of this video a little more concise, I want to use a particular phrase, and I want to define it so that it makes sense to everybody. It's called doing history. Now, you might not think that your paper about a certain kind of activism, particularly if it's contemporary and if it's American, has much history in it, or that you will need to do very much historical research to talk about it and to make your thesis, to make your point. Consider this, though. Whenever you have two events and you refer to them together, and they happened between 15 or 50 years ago, and you're making one point with the both of them, you're using those two historical moments in tandem. You're relating them to each other. To do so, it puts them in a sequence, which puts them into a narrative or a story, which is basically what historians do. I mean, the Civil War is a bunch of events in a row, starting with the secession of South Carolina in 1860, and culminating in the surrender of Robert E. Lee in 1864, 1865. So, when you connect past events together in your writing, as more than just an aside, you're doing history. Undoubtedly, you'll do this for your paper. To do it credibly, you have to be pretty careful. Usually, being careful just means using plain logic. For example, someone in their paper might say, well, America became a superpower because it won World War II. Those are actually non sequitur. They may seem causal, but they're not. So when you talk about history, you got to think about it first and ask yourself, okay, how do I know this? Does it really make sense? I want to give you a couple bad examples of doing history. Both of these are poorly drawn conclusions. When you're relating those two historical events and putting them into a narrative, they often add up to a certain thing. So I'll start off with bad examples of what I mean by that and give you a good one. So the first happened to me in a discussion group led by TA. There was a painting from the 16th century portraying a settler or explorer or some kind of clergyman meeting Native Americans as if they had just gotten off the boat and they were total strangers to each other. It was a really rich painting. There were a lot of trees and backgrounds, and their expressions were captured, and it was beautiful. And there were animals. One animal looked like a three-toed sloth. So a student in the class said, well, the painter reflected Europeans' negative attitudes towards Americans because the sloth on that tree suggests that they're lazy, like slovenly. So the only problem with saying that is sloths are a Latin American animal. The first settlers landed in North America, and the interior of South America hadn't really been explored yet. Not by Cortez, Pizarro, whoever, not by anybody. The animal sloth probably was not discovered yet, let alone inserted into standard English vocabulary. So how could that person's painting with that animal that looks like a sloth say that? I'm not even sure the artist was English, in which case the word sloth is completely moot. So make sure the statements in your paper make sense. Second story. Some historians of William Shakespeare, the ones who think he's a fake, that he didn't actually write all those plays that Francis Bacon did or whoever else did, say that the famous playwright never owned a book. And that's obviously evidence that he's not an actual playwright. Biographer Bill Bison tells us that their reasoning for this is that there isn't any evidence of him owning a book. By the same logic, Bison writes, Shakespeare never wore pants, because there's no direct evidence of him ever wearing pants. But facts lend themselves to both of these ideas, that he didn't wear pants and that he didn't own books, being false. You can infer those things. So the lesson in all this is this: when you present your own ideas, be able to answer, how do you know that? Similarly, when you present other historical facts as evidence, make sure they know what they're talking about. When you just cite a date, make sure your source is credible, in other words. Don't steal some speculation off of somebody else's paper. This problem is usually avoided by basic plagiarism, non-plagiarism. So pardon me. So those are the two bad examples. Here's a good example of drawing historical conclusions, a good example. In reading about the empires involved in World War I, so you had Germany and the British Empire and the Russian Empire, a lot of the rhetoric involved the word nationalism. You might have remembered from history class that nationalism kind of led up to World War I. Leaders refer to their political entities or their countries as nations. Leaders from those same locales 200 years earlier did not use the word nation. Princes in Germany had no concept or use for nation, but the Kaiser did. So it turns out that no one in those areas in maybe 1700 or so thought of themselves as belonging to a group identified by its nationality. That wasn't really a concept. So we can conclude then that even though the contemporary leaders would talk about their nation going back hundreds of years, nations are basically intangible, somewhat contrived, man-made institutions. However tempting it might be to think of nation and country synonymously. So that's a conclusion, a sound conclusion that we drew. Leaders used the word nation later in time. They didn't, leaders from the same country backward in time did not use the word nation or the concept nationalism. Therefore, nationalism is a construct, an institution. That's a good way of drawing a historical conclusion. Doing history can be pretty hard to pull off if you don't have the knowledge of whatever background is relevant to your topic. It's just harder to make concrete sense of things. Basically, you might not know that my America in World War II, winning it made it a superpower. You might not know that there's not a causal relationship there. So that's kind of the hitch. But striving to do history better and to read more history will help you understand your topic more fully. It can also make your argument a lot stronger. Verification and fact-checking, again, is part of this, and it's important. I would also, that being said, I would advise not to get too bogged down in it.